When developing an extension using Visual Studio, we're going to go over the various concepts and concerns around this particular tool. If you've gone through these sections in order, we'll have talked about the Napa tool set for doing client-side development and SharePoint app development. We've talked about SharePoint Designer for working with workflows, both specific case and creating workflow templates. But now that we're working with Visual Studio, we'll actually be looking at all of these types of projects because Visual Studio is kind of the Swiss Army knife of your tools to develop with SharePoint. We'll be able to work with all of these different types of projects, and I'll give you a demo of working with them at the end of this section. So let's step first off into why use Visual Studio. Visual Studio is still the best way to develop complex SharePoint extensions. As we saw with SharePoint Designer, you can validate workflows. You've got some debugging capabilities and some notification information in Napa. But still, to get really deep down into code, to do performance analysis, to do the ability to do class diagrams, and a lot of the very extensive lifecycle capabilities of development, Visual Studio is still head and shoulders above everything else in making sure that you've got everything that you need to create a complex solution. Visual Studio also has templates and packaging tools for SharePoint. The solutions, but also for the apps, for the workflows, for the web parts. All of these are kind of built into Visual Studio. This is not something that's always been the case. But now that kind of Visual Studio and SharePoint are in sync as far as releases, you're going to see that pairing up Visual Studio to its current generation of SharePoint means that you're going to be pretty much in lockstep. Your tools are going to be very tightly integrated with SharePoint. So things are going to be very nice there. You're able to put together your solutions in a comfortable environment, in an environment that handles pretty much any of your .NET languages that you're looking at or JavaScript, to be able to actually do deploys very easily to your testing environment, your development environment, and be able to get rapid feedback, do debugging, all of those kind of pieces. And because these are your familiar tools, you're not having to kind of learn what's going on or poke around. If you're a developer that normally spends your days in Visual Studio, having a comfortable environment that you already know what's going on, maybe an environment that you already have all of the hotkeys in muscle memory, makes things very easy. You also have situations where maybe you've got development tools that really help you out. Maybe you're a JetBrains guy, or you've got some other dev tool. Those fit in there and work with SharePoint just fine as well. One of the things I was going to mention is setting up the dev environment. When you're putting together your dev environment, just know that in the past, the dev environment has changed pretty dramatically. We've had situations where SharePoint has to have an external server that you've had to do remote debugging, that you've had to deploy on the server. SharePoint in some generations has allowed you to install on Windows 7 or all of those kind of pieces. Know that in 2013 you do need to be developing on a server environment. I believe the reason why the team kind of went this direction is because virtualization has become so prevalent and so easy to do. Do look at Windows Server 2008 R2 SP1 64, or just go ahead and get Windows Server 2012. Makes it a lot easier. Go ahead and you're probably going to be running your SharePoint 2013 on at least Windows Server 2012, so it makes it a little easier to install there. Hyper-V is generally the best. If you've got anything like a modern dev environment, that's going to be something that's pretty easy, either on a laptop. I actually use a nice i7 with, I only have 16 gig of RAM. Recommend at least 24 gig for your SharePoint development, but you can get it a lot lower if you have to. Be able to drop that in there, or you can even do such things as have a remote virtual machine set up. One of the things that's kind of interesting is that if you have an MSDN subscription, you can actually go in and set up a virtual machine that has SharePoint already installed, and there are actually some Visual Studio implementations. I Check with your virtual machine libraries when you take this course. There's very likely a virtual machine you can start off with that saves you a lot of time, but if not, creating a virtual machine inside an Azure or other cloud provider virtual machine can save you a lot of local storage as well. Just make sure you've got enough bandwidth to get to it, because there's nothing worse than typing along and having lag when you're creating your code. So just think about that when you're putting together your development environment. SharePoint 2013 requires at least Visual Studio 2012, and if you have 2012, make sure you install the tools update for it. Now again, Visual Studio stays really well in sync with SharePoint. If you've got access to 2012 and not 2013, that's an acceptable solution. But really, if you're going to be doing solutions development or any kind of development with Visual Studio and SharePoint 2013, you probably should have access to Visual Studio 2013 and go ahead and pick it up with that. If you need to run side by side on your machine with a Visual Studio 2012 for maybe infrastructure or whatever, it does that fine. So just be aware of that and do yourself a favor and use the tools as the best tools that you can for the process. When we go into the demo, I'm going to look at walking you through some of the steps for creating that dev environment. That being said, I'm putting right here some links for how to get to your different capabilities. Sometimes people ask, well, where do I find the trial version, something that I can actually put in and work out for free? My ops guys don't let me have a dedicated server, those kind of things. You've got the URLs right here for the eval centers to be able to pull down copies of Windows Server 2012 R2 and Microsoft SharePoint Server 2013. Do note that the 2013 SharePoint Server is an enterprise, is that top tier level. If you're going through and doing the trial, just be aware that it may have some features that you may not be looking at for a more limited deployment, and be very careful about that. You can actually go through and deactivate those features if you choose to, but be aware as you're developing that you're not basically using some capabilities that licensing wise you may not have. That's one of the biggest challenges in setting up the dev environment, keeping that in sync. Hyper-V is available on Windows Server 2012 and Windows 8 Pro. I personally use Windows 8 Pro. It's a little lighter weight. I know people that swear by running their server because it helps them be a little bit closer to the metal. It helps them actually handle things the way they choose to. Either way, you're fine if you're putting it in there. If you're going on the metal, of course, you're going to need to install the Windows Server 2012 on your hard drive if you're not using any virtualization system. So your choice on that one. Again, if you're putting together a full demo environment, I absolutely would not recommend anything less than 12 gigs. I've gotten away with that with RAM and being able to be kind of, it gets a little bit slow, but it actually still works pretty well. Ideally, if you're looking at really kind of looking at all the different pieces or having all the moving parts working inside of SharePoint, looking at 24 gig or more of RAM. Again, you absolutely have to be looking at 64-bit. Don't even think about 32-bit in your dev environment or your demo environment. So be thinking about that as you look through things. Here we have a quick screenshot. We're going to look into this in the demo, but I just wanted to mention here that SharePoint 2013 does have quite a number of templates featured specifically around SharePoint. And you notice here we've got our SharePoint solutions. I'm a C# guy, but VB also has this as well. We've got the empty project if you know what's going on. Silverlight web parts are still around, so if you've got things that you're working with in Silverlight, note that you're not left out in the cold. Those are still available, and you've got the templates to put those in place. Visual web parts, being able to put those in place and work with what's going on there. Import solutions package. This is one that if you've already got something that you're working with, maybe another dev team would put it together and send it off to operations. Operations has that package, but you may not have everything else. You can pull that in and work with some of the configurations around that. So that's pretty nice to have. It's not going to get you everything, but know that you can pull those in. The reusable Visual Studio develop workflows and either maintain them or tweak them over and put them in SharePoint 2013 workflows. Very, very useful. And you can see that we keep our SharePoint 2010 templates as well. So if one of your concerns about moving to Visual Studio 2013 is not being able to support those back versions of SharePoint, you can see right here you can still continue to do new development. You've got those templates to create new capabilities inside of those previous versions of SharePoint. So good to know, good to have at your fingertips. And then we also look at the app model. As I mentioned, with Napa being able to do a no install dev environment for those SharePoint apps, know that you can do it in Visual Studio as well. If you're used to it, if you've already got everything deployed and installed for Visual Studio, there's no requirement to go through the provisioning of an Office 365 account and then adding the Napa tools, though I think you probably do want to have that in your tool belt. Know that it's not required and that you can create those apps inside of Visual Studio just as well as you can inside of Napa. In some ways, you actually using Visual Studio gives you additional capabilities, things such as, again, you see Visual C# rather than just being JavaScript, being able to actually work with some different languages and capabilities. You get some extended capabilities by doing those apps inside of Visual Studio, and we'll look at those as we go through the demo.